The wolves had been at her for hours when Jake Brennan found what was left of the Apache girl tied to the burned wagon wheel. Dawn was breaking over the Red Rock Canyon, painting the cliffs the color of dried blood. Buzzards circled overhead like black omens, waiting their turn. Jake had been tracking his scattered cattle since first light, following the wolf prints in the sand, when he heard the low growling ahead. She was unconscious, slumped against the charred wood, her torn dress dark with blood. Rope burns marked her wrists where the cavalry had bound her before riding away. The wolves had gotten to her legs, but something had kept them from her throat. Maybe the sound of Jake's approaching horse, maybe just luck. Jake cut the ropes with his knife, his hands moving gentle despite their roughness. War had taught him to hate Apaches, but this wasn't war. This was murder, plain and simple. He wrapped her in his coat and lifted her onto his horse, her head falling against his shoulder like a child's. The wolves circled back, testing his resolve with yellow eyes and bared teeth. Jake fired a warning shot that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. As he spurred his horse toward home, the unconscious girl stirring against him, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from behind. 20 riders, coming fast from the east, and they weren't coming to help. Jake Brennan had spent 30 years staying out of other folks' trouble. Today, that was about to cost him everything. He pushed his horse hard across the desert, the Apache woman's fever burning through his coat. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger. Bounty hunters, by the look of them, armed and riding with purpose. His ranch lay another 5 miles ahead, nestled in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains where a man could make a stand if he had to. The year was 1881, and Arizona Territory was a place where law came from the barrel of a gun and mercy was a luxury most folks couldn't afford. Jake had chosen this isolation after burying his wife and son, preferring the company of cattle to the judgment of men. But something about the broken woman in his arms reminded him of why he'd become a soldier in the first place, not to kill, but to protect. His ranch appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage made real. Adobe buildings baked white by the sun, empty corrals where his scattered cattle should have been grazing. The place had been his sanctuary for 15 years, ever since typhus fever took his boy and grief took his wife. He'd built it with his own hands, stone by stone, seeking solitude in the harsh beauty of the desert. He carried the woman inside, laying her on his own bed before starting a fire. The room still held traces of his old life, a child's wooden horse on the mantel, his wife's Bible on the nightstand. Memories he'd tried to bury but couldn't quite abandon. Water, clean cloth, whatever medicine he could manage. The same desperate care he'd tried to give his dying son years before, when all the love in the world couldn't stop the fever from taking what mattered most. The woman's breathing was shallow, her skin hot as a branding iron. Wolf bites on her legs, rope burns on her wrists, but it was the look of abandonment in her face that cut deepest. Someone had left her to die like she was nothing more than garbage, and that kind of cruelty made Jake's blood run cold. The bounty hunters arrived an hour later, 3 hard men with federal badges and harder eyes. Jake met them on his porch, Winchester across his lap, playing the part of a rancher annoyed by trespassers. Their leader was a scarred man named Fletcher, who'd made a career of hunting human beings for government money. "We're tracking hostile Apaches," Fletcher said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Raid's been hitting settlements all week. Killed a family over near Benson, took their horses and supplies. You seen any?" Jake kept his face neutral, though his gut told him these men wouldn't know the truth if it bit them on the backside. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians. Been chasing wolves off my cattle all morning. Lost 3 head to the pack." They searched his outbuildings but didn't ask to come inside the house. Men like these understood property lines, even if they didn't respect much else. Fletcher's eyes lingered on the adobe walls, calculating angles and escape routes, like a man who expected trouble everywhere he went. "You served in the war?" Fletcher asked, noting Jake's military bearing. "Confederate cavalry. Did my time, came home, minded my own business ever since." "Smart man, war's over, but some folks ain't learned that lesson yet." "Apache don't understand anything but superior firepower." After they rode away, Jake allowed himself one deep breath. The woman stirring in his bed represented everything these men would kill without a second thought, and he just lied to federal officers to protect her. No going back now. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Doc Holliday, thin as a rail and pale as paper, but still the sharpest mind in 3 territories. He claimed to be checking on a business proposition, but his eyes took in the signs of medical care: the boiled water, the torn cloth, the smell of carbolic acid. "Friend of yours laid up?" Doc asked, his voice carrying the rasp of his consumption. "Sick calf," Jake lied, wondering how many more lies he'd have to tell before this was over. Doc nodded, but his eyes said he understood more than he was letting on. Man's got to tend his stock, especially the ones that can't tend themselves. Sometimes a sick animal needs more care than healthy ones, if you catch my meaning. That night, Jake dozed by the fire while the woman's fever raged. He'd fought Apaches during the war, killed his share and more. But watching her fight for life in his bed, he couldn't remember why any of that had seemed to matter. Around midnight, her eyes opened, dark as coffee, wide with fear that slowly changed to confusion. In clear English, she whispered 3 words that changed everything. "You saved me." The Apache woman could speak English better than most white folks Jake knew, and that realization hit him like a kick from a green bronc. Her name was Ayanna, she told him over coffee the next morning, sitting up in his kitchen chair like she belonged there. It meant eternal blossom in her language, though she'd learned to answer to Mary at the mission school, where the government had tried to civilize her. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. They'd educated her just enough to make betraying her that much easier. "I am daughter of Chief Naichi," she said, watching Jake's face for his reaction. "Does this frighten you?" Jake nearly choked on his coffee. The chief's daughter. He'd just painted a target on both their backs the size of the whole Arizona territory. Naichi was a war leader whose name was spoken in whispers from Mexico to Colorado, a man who'd never bent the knee to any government and never would. "Should it frighten me?" Jake asked, setting down his cup with deliberate calm. "Most white men think Apache women are either slaves or demons. Nothing in between." "Most white men are damn fools," Jake said, then caught himself. "Pardon my language, miss." Ayanna's laugh was like water over stones. "I have heard worse words from missionaries trying to save my soul." Her story came out in pieces, like water from a poisoned well. She'd been riding under a white flag to negotiate peace, carrying a signed letter from the territorial governor himself. The cavalry patrol had stopped her party in the canyon, asked to see the documents, then opened fire without warning. Her escorts died fighting, buying time for her to hide the papers before they bound her to that wagon wheel. "They left me for the wolves, making it look like another Apache raid gone wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the memory. "But I heard them talking while they thought I was unconscious. Someone paid them to make sure those peace talks never happened." Jake felt the pieces clicking together like parts of a well-oiled rifle. Someone wanted those peace talks to fail. Question is, who benefits from keeping this war going? The answer came with Miguel Vasquez that afternoon. His Mexican ranch hand had been with Jake for 5 years, a steady man with a family who understood the difference between gossip and information worth dying for. Miguel's news curdled Jake's blood like milk left in the sun. "Apache scouts spotted on the ridgelines, Jefe," Miguel said, his hat in his hands. "War drums echoing across the peaks. The whole Apache nation knows their chief's daughter is missing, and they're coming to find her." "There's more, isn't there?" Jake could read the worry in Miguel's weathered face. "Federal marshal's been asking questions about you in town. Says all hostiles got to be surrendered immediately, no exceptions. Banker Morrison's been real interested in your answers." Jake looked through the window at Ayanna, who was helping Miguel's wife Rosa prepare dinner like she'd been part of their family for years. She moved with quiet dignity despite her injuries, and when their eyes met across the room, something passed between them that had nothing to do with war or treaties or the color of their skin. "What do you think, Miguel? Should I hand her over?" Miguel considered the question seriously, the way he considered all matters of conscience. "My grandmother always said you judge a man by how he treats folks who can't do nothing for him in return. This woman, She can't give you nothing but trouble. But trouble ain't always a bad thing, if it's the right kind of trouble. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains red. Jake tried to explain why he'd risked everything for someone he was supposed to consider an enemy. But the words came hard. He'd never been much for talking about feelings. Maybe because you ain't the enemy, he said finally. Maybe I've been fighting the wrong war all these years. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, working beadwork in her lap with fingers that moved like they remembered better times. In my language, we have no word for enemy, she said. Only stranger and family. You chose to make me family when the world made me stranger. Didn't feel like a choice, Jake admitted. Felt like the only thing a decent man could do. That is what makes you different from the soldiers who left me to die. They had the same choice. They chose differently. As thunder rolled across the peaks that night, Jake heard what chilled his blood. The sound of Apache war drums, and they were getting closer. The war drums echoed across the canyon like the heartbeat of some angry god, and Jake Brennan found himself teaching an Apache woman to use his Winchester by firelight. Hold it firm, but don't fight it, he told Ayana, guiding her hands to the stock. This rifle saved my life more times than I can count. If something happens to me... She looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Nothing will happen to you. I will not allow it. The certainty in her voice surprised him. This woman who'd been left for dead was now talking about protecting him, and somehow that didn't seem strange at all. She worked alongside him the next morning, helping with chores despite her injuries, proving she was nobody's helpless victim. Her hands were gentle with the animals, and Jake noticed how his old milk cow seemed to calm under her touch. They talked while they worked, sharing stories that crossed the divide between their worlds. Jake told her about his boy, taken by typhus fever when he was only 8. How he'd held that small hand until it went cold, promising things he couldn't deliver, making bargains with a god who didn't seem to be listening. His name was Thomas, Jake said, forking hay into the stalls. Tom, always getting into mischief, always asking why the sky was blue or where the wind came from. Smart as a whip, that boy. Ayana spoke of watching her younger brother learn to ride, before the soldiers came and changed everything forever. How he'd laughed when he finally stayed on the pony's back, his joy echoing across the village like music. We are both carrying ghosts, she said, and Jake understood exactly what she meant. Some wounds never healed, just learned to hurt less over time. The peaceful morning shattered when banker Morrison arrived with 2 armed escorts and what he called a generous offer for Jake's ranch. Cash money, enough to start over somewhere far from Apache trouble. The kind of deal that wasn't really a deal at all. Morrison was a soft man gone hard around the edges, the type who'd never done an honest day's work, but somehow always had clean hands and full pockets. His escorts wore guns like jewelry, all flash and threat, with nothing substantial underneath. Times are changing, Brennan, Morrison said, mopping sweat from his face despite the autumn chill. Man needs to know which way the wind's blowing, if you catch my meaning. Apache trouble's only going to get worse, and folks like you get caught in the middle. Jake caught his meaning just fine. Morrison wanted him gone, and Jake was starting to understand why. A rancher who could make peace with Apaches was bad for certain kinds of business, the kind that depended on fear and hatred to turn a profit. Appreciate the offer, Jake said, keeping his voice level. But this land suits me fine. Been here 15 years, plan to stay 15 more. Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Hope you don't come to regret that decision, Brennan. Times are uncertain. Accidents happen. After they left, Jake found Ayana watching from the kitchen window, her face pale but determined. She'd understood the threat perfectly, same as he had. The federal patrol that came searching the next day nearly found her. Jake hid Ayana in the root cellar while soldiers turned his house upside down, looking for evidence of Apache sympathizers. The young lieutenant who led them was nervous as a cat, asking too many questions about Jake's recent visitors. We know you've been harboring hostiles, the lieutenant said, overturning furniture with unnecessary violence. Wouldn't want anything to happen to a patriotic veteran like yourself. These Apache, they're animals, Brennan. Can't reason with animals. Jake bit back his first 3 responses, all of which would have started a war right there in his parlor. "Only animals I've seen lately been wolves after my cattle," he said. "You boys find what you're looking for, you let me know." After they left, Jake helped Ayana out of the cellar, her face pale from the close air and closer call. She'd heard every word, understood exactly how much danger they were both in, but instead of fear, he saw something else in her eyes, a fierce determination that reminded him why Apache women were respected as much as feared. That night, her fever returned with a vengeance. Jake spent hours with cool cloths and whispered prayers, watching infections spread through wounds that should have been healing. In her delirium, she called him father in Apache, and something deep in his chest cracked open like a fault line. He'd failed to save his son. Maybe, just maybe, he could save her. Outside, coyotes howled their lonesome songs, but underneath their voices was something else, the distant sound of horses moving in formation. Miguel burst through the door just before dawn, blood on his shirt and terror in his eyes. "They're coming from 3 directions," he gasped, "and they ain't here to talk." Marshal Wade arrived with the sunrise and a folder full of lies that he claimed were evidence. The federal marshal was a man built like a scarred oak tree, all hard angles and weathered bark. He spread photographs across Jake's kitchen table with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Each picture showed scenes of Apache raids, burned homesteads, scattered belongings, the aftermath of violence. "This Apache woman," Wade said, tapping the images with a thick finger, "is wanted for leading raids against 3 settlements. Territorial authorities consider her extremely dangerous. We have witnesses placing her at each scene." Jake studied the pictures, his mind working like the cavalry officer he'd once been. Something was wrong with the dates. The raids had supposedly happened while Ayana was at the mission school, learning to read Bible verses and speak proper English. He'd seen enough false evidence during the war to recognize a frame-up when it stared him in the face. "Funny thing about evidence," Jake said carefully, keeping his voice neutral. "Sometimes it tells a different story than the one folks want to hear." Wade's jaw tightened like a steel trap. "You questioning federal authority, Brennan?" "Just questioning math. Hard to be raiding settlements when you're 50 miles away learning Sunday school hymns. These dates here," Jake pointed to the photographs. "September 15th, September 22nd, October 1st. I happen to know this woman was at the San Carlos mission during that whole time, teaching Apache children to read." "How would you know that?" Wade's voice carried a threat that made the air in the room feel heavy. "Because I make it my business to know what's happening in my territory. Man doesn't survive out here by keeping his eyes closed." That's when the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Someone had been staging Apache raids, using them to justify something bigger. Jake thought about Morrison's nervous visit, the federal patrol's strange questions, the way certain people seemed mighty eager to see more Apache blood spilled. Miguel confirmed Jake's suspicions when he returned from town with Morrison's carelessly discarded papers. The banker had been purchasing mineral rights to Apache burial grounds, buying land that wasn't even officially available yet. The dates on the contracts predated the raids by 2 months, a smoking gun that proved premeditation. "Look at this, Jefe," Miguel said, spreading the documents on the same table where Wade had displayed his false evidence. "Morrison's been planning this from the beginning. Mining contracts for silver deposits on Apache sacred land, signed and sealed before the first raid ever happened." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. "They've been planning this from the beginning," he told Ayana when she emerged from the back room. "The fake raids, the failed peace talks, leaving you for dead, it's all been about clearing the Apache off land they want to mine." Ayana's face went hard as granite. "My people's burial grounds, where our ancestors sleep. They would destroy the bones of the dead for silver?" "Some men would sell their own mothers for the right price," Jake said grimly. Up on the canyon rim, 50 Apache warriors sat their horses in full war paint, waiting for their chief's command. Chief Naichi himself was among them, a man whose word was law from Mexico to Colorado. Jake could see them through his field glasses, proud and patient as carved stone. But he knew that patience wouldn't last forever. The war party had been assembling since dawn, warriors from different bands coming together for their chief's daughter. They carried traditional weapons alongside modern rifles, painted for war but still following the old protocols. Jake had fought against men like these during his cavalry days, and he knew they were as dangerous as they were honorable. Ayanna found him watching the ridgeline, and without a word, she touched his arm with fingers that trembled slightly. "I could surrender myself," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "My death would end this. Your life would continue." Jake turned to face her, this woman who'd somehow become more important to him than his own safety. In just 3 days, she'd filled spaces in his life he hadn't even known were empty. The thought of losing her felt like facing that typhus fever all over again, watching helplessly while something precious slipped away. "Some things matter more than living," he said, meaning every word. "Some folks are worth dying for." That evening, Apache scouts tested his defenses, slipping close enough to count his ammunition before melting back into the rocks like shadows. Jake fired warning shots and displayed a white flag, establishing the rules of engagement. Even in war, some men still respected honor. The night air carried the sound of drums and chanting, Apache voices raised in songs that spoke of loss and vengeance. But underneath the traditional words, Jake heard something else. Grief for a daughter who might already be dead, and the terrible weight of a father's love turned to fury. As full darkness fell, a voice carried across the canyon like thunder itself. Chief Naichi speaking from the ridge in English clear as church bells. "White man who holds my daughter, we meet at sunrise. Come alone, or watch your house burn." Jake spent the hours before dawn cleaning his guns and trying to convince Ayanna to stay hidden while he faced her father alone. "I will not cower while men decide my fate," she said, checking the action on the Winchester he'd taught her to use. Her movements were sure and steady, no tremor in her hands despite the gravity of what morning would bring. "I speak for myself, or I do not speak at all." There was steel in her voice that reminded Jake why Apache women were respected as much as feared. He'd learned to trust her judgment over the past few days, even when it went against every protective instinct he possessed. She wasn't some fragile flower that needed shielding from hard truths. She was a warrior in her own right, shaped by the same harsh country that had forged him. Miguel's family had chosen to stay despite the danger, turning the ranch into a fortress with whatever they could find. Miguel's wife, Rosa, showed the same quiet courage as her husband, while their children helped stack firewood and fill water barrels like it was just another day's work. Their youngest, a boy of 6 named Carlos, treated the whole situation like an adventure, chattering in Spanish about Apache warriors and brave cowboys. "You should take your family and go," Jake told Miguel as they reinforced the windows with furniture. "This ain't your fight." Miguel paused in his hammering, considering the words carefully. "My family has been here 5 years, Jefe. We have planted corn in this soil, buried a stillborn daughter under that cottonwood tree. This is our home, too. A man does not abandon his home because of trouble." The town delegation arrived before the sun cleared the peaks. A dozen men led by banker Morrison, all carrying rifles in righteous anger. They wanted Ayanna handed over immediately, claimed they were protecting the community from Apache vengeance. But Jake could see the fear in their eyes, the way they kept glancing at the ridgeline where painted warriors waited like birds of prey. "You're harboring a killer, Brennan," Morrison declared, his voice pitched loud enough for the whole canyon to hear. "Hand her over, or we'll burn you out ourselves. The community's spoken." Jake stepped onto his porch, Winchester in hand, measuring the distance between himself and 12 armed men. Not impossible odds, but not comfortable ones either. "This is my land," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down cavalry charges. "Anyone who wants trouble can find it right here." That's when Doc Holliday chose to make his entrance, riding up the trail like death on horseback. His thin frame swayed in the saddle, but his gun hand was steady as ever, and his reputation preceded him like a cold wind. "Seems like long odds, Jake," Doc said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp. "Mind if I even them up a little?" The townsmen backed down, but their eyes promised this wasn't finished. Morrison's face was pale with fury, and Jake could see the banker calculating how much this defiance was going to cost him. Men like Morrison didn't forgive, and they never forgot. Federal cavalry appeared on the southern horizon as the town mob dispersed, another pressure closing in like the jaws of a trap. Marshal Wade was positioning his pieces for whatever endgame he had planned, and Jake was starting to understand just how deep this conspiracy went. The corruption reached from the territorial capital all the way down to local banks, a web of greed that used Apache blood as currency. "They're boxing us in," Doc observed, studying the cavalry positions through field glasses. "Wade's got maybe 60 men down there, all armed with Spencer repeaters, professional soldiers, not like Morrison's shopkeepers." That afternoon brought sabotage. Miguel discovered the well had been poisoned. The water turned bitter with some chemical that burned the throat and twisted the gut. It was meant to weaken them before the final assault, but Miguel's sharp nose had saved them all from a slow death. "Morrison's men," Miguel reported, his face grim. "I saw them riding away from the water source just after midnight. They didn't expect anyone to be watching, but I couldn't sleep. My Carlos, he was coughing from the bad air." Jake felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. Poisoning a well was the act of a coward, the kind of man who'd murder children to protect his profits. "We got enough water stored for maybe 3 days," he said. After that, we pray for rain," Rosa said quietly. "Or we make our peace with God." The federal ultimatum came with the evening shadows: surrender the Apache woman by noon tomorrow, or face military action. No negotiation, no compromise, just the cold mathematics of superior firepower delivered by a nervous lieutenant who couldn't meet Jake's eyes. Jake read the telegram twice, then burned it in the fireplace. Some decisions couldn't be unmade, and some lines couldn't be uncrossed. He'd chosen his side when he cut those ropes in the canyon, and he'd stand by that choice no matter the cost. Ayanna found him on the porch as the stars came out, brilliant and countless in the desert sky. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the sage smoke in her hair, feel the warmth of her presence in the cooling night air. "Do you regret saving me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake considered the question seriously. His cattle were scattered, his neighbors wanted him dead, and 3 different armies were closing in on his ranch. By any reasonable measure, helping her had been the stupidest thing he'd ever done. "Only regret I got," he said finally, "is that it took me so long to remember what I was fighting for in the first place." As if summoned by his words, signal fires blazed to life on the surrounding peaks, Apache, federal, and civilian forces all moving into position for tomorrow's reckoning. War was coming to the Dragoon Mountains, and Jake Brennan stood at the center of it all. Sunrise came like Judgment Day, painting the canyon floor red as blood while 3 armies converged on neutral ground. Jake rode out with Ayanna beside him, both armed but flying a white flag that meant parley under Apache law. The morning air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of sage and the distant smell of wood smoke from Apache fires. Chief Naichi waited with a dozen warriors, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold morning air, breath steaming like dragon's mist. Marshal Wade approached from the south with a full cavalry unit, brass buttons gleaming in the early light, guidons snapping in the desert wind. Morrison's hired guns watched from the ridges like vultures, positioned to control the high ground no matter how the negotiations went. The whole canyon felt like a powder keg with 3 different men holding lit matches. The speaking circle formed according to ancient custom, with each leader bringing their truth to the sacred ground. Jake had been to enough treaty councils during his cavalry days to know the forms, even if this one felt more like a trial than a negotiation. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into zones of light and darkness. Chief Naichi spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of generations. He was older than Jake had expected, with silver threading through his black hair and lines carved deep by desert sun and constant vigilance. But his eyes burned with the fierce intelligence that had kept the Apache free when other tribes had surrendered. "My daughter was taken under white flag," Naichi said, each word measured and deliberate. "Apache law demands blood for blood. The spirits of our ancestors cry out for justice." Marshal Wade's response was pure federal authority, delivered with the mechanical precision of a man who'd never questioned an order in his life. The woman is wanted for crimes against the United States. She will be surrendered to proper custody immediately. This is not a matter for negotiation. Jake looked at both men, then at Ayanna, who sat her horse with the dignity of a queen facing execution. The morning light caught the beadwork on her dress, traditional patterns that told stories of her people's history. She'd chosen to wear Apache clothing for this meeting, declaring her identity without apology. Before anybody starts spilling blood, Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, maybe we ought to hear what really happened out there. That's when Ayanna produced the documents she'd hidden in her saddle, papers that changed everything. Morrison's mining contracts, dated 2 months before the first Apache raid. Land deeds for territory not yet pacified. Bills of sale for mineral rights to sacred burial grounds that no one was supposed to know contained silver. This woman carries proof of white man's treachery, Chief Naichi said, his voice like winter wind across mountain peaks. Your government makes war on paper before making war with guns. Wade's face went pale as he recognized the documents, understanding immediately how damaging they would be if they reached the territorial capital. His hand moved toward his weapon, a motion Jake caught instantly from years of watching for such tells. That evidence goes to the territorial governor, Jake said, his rifle already trained on the marshal, along with testimony about how federal marshals help mining companies steal Indian land. The shooting started when Wade decided bullets were easier than explanations. Jake dove sideways, pushing Ayanna behind his horse as gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Apache warriors charged down from the ridges while cavalry bugles sounded the attack, their brass voices echoing off canyon walls like the last trumpet. In the chaos, Ayanna threw herself across the scattered documents, taking a bullet in the shoulder to protect the evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy. Jake's rage burned white-hot as he returned fire, each shot finding its mark among Wade's crooked deputies. The sight of her blood on those papers unleashed something primal in him, something that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with a man protecting his family. Chief Naichi fought beside them, his war cry echoing off the canyon walls as he recognized the truth. His daughter's honor was worth more than his old enemy's life. For the first time in 30 years of frontier warfare, Apache and white men stood together against a common enemy, their rifles speaking the same language of justice. Doc Holliday appeared through the gunsmoke like an avenging angel, bringing word that changed everything. The territorial governor's investigator was already en route, summoned by messages Doc had sent through his network of contacts. The conspiracy was unraveling, but Wade and Morrison still had cards to play. "Fall back to the ranch," Jake shouted over the gunfire, helping Ayanna onto her horse while blood soaked her dress. "We make our stand there." They fought a running battle across the desert, Apache warriors covering their retreat while federal bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Ayanna swayed in her saddle, but her grip on the precious documents never loosened, even as infection began spreading through her shoulder wound. After Jake helped her tend the wound with strips torn from his shirt, she spoke quietly in Apache while her father translated his words of respect. "She says you fight like her brother," Naichi said, something like approval in his weathered face. "This is high praise from Apache woman." "Tell her," Jake said, wrapping the bandage tight, "that she fights like my daughter. And I'm proud as hell of her." As they reached the ranch compound, Jake heard the sound that chilled his blood. Morrison's hired guns flanking from the north, while more federal troops approached from the south. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. But they had something their enemies didn't: the truth. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world. The ranch became a fortress as Apache warriors and Mexican vaqueros fought alongside a Confederate veteran and a consumptive gambler, defending truth against overwhelming odds. Chief Naichi positioned his men in the rocks above the compound, their knowledge of desert warfare turning every boulder into a sniper's nest. Miguel's family barricaded the house with furniture and grain sacks, while Doc Holliday coughed blood onto his shirt front but kept his gun steady. Jake moved between positions, coordinating a defense that would have been impossible without Apache knowledge of the terrain. The attackers came in waves, testing different approaches like water finding cracks in stone. Morrison's hired killers had superior numbers, but they were city men fighting desert war against people who'd been born to it. Every time they tried to advance, Apache rifles spoke from the shadows, sending them scrambling back to cover. Night fighting favored the defenders even more. Apache warriors slipped through Morrison's lines like ghosts, cutting supply lines and eliminating sentries with silent efficiency. Jake watched through his field glasses as painted figures moved across the moonlit landscape, striking without warning before vanishing into darkness that seemed to swallow them whole. "Your father's men are artists," Jake told Ayanna as they watched another supply wagon burn in the distance. "They have been fighting this war since before you were born," she replied, wincing as Rosa changed her bandages. "They know every rock, every shadow, every way the wind carries sound in these canyons." Inside the ranch house, the wounded gathered around Rosa's kitchen table while she worked by lamplight to save what lives she could. Ayana's shoulder was bound tight, but infection was spreading despite Doc's medical attention. Miguel's youngest son, Carlos, had taken shrapnel in the leg from a stray artillery shell, crying for his mother in Spanish and English both while she held him close. "The children shouldn't be here," Doc said, cleaning his spectacles with shaking hands. His consumption was getting worse under the stress, each breath a visible struggle. "The children shouldn't have to be anywhere," Jake replied, watching through the window as muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly stars. "But this is the world we've made for them." Morrison's desperation showed in his tactics as the night wore on. Orders came down to eliminate all witnesses, burn the ranch, and blame everything on Apache savages. No mercy, no survivors, no inconvenient testimony to complicate the official story. The hired guns began using incendiary rounds, trying to set the buildings ablaze from a distance. Federal troops remained divided as the siege continued. Some followed Wade's illegal orders without question, but others began questioning why they were attacking civilians who flew the American flag. Military discipline warred with military honor as young soldiers tried to understand what they were really fighting for. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the banker despite the name, approached Jake's position under a white flag just after midnight. The young officer's face was pale in the moonlight, his uniform dusty and torn from crawling through the rocks. "This isn't right, Brennan," the lieutenant said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're soldiers, not murderers. Half my men are talking about desertion." "Then why are you still shooting at us?" Jake asked, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed. "Because Marshal Wade says you're harboring enemy combatants. But that woman in there, she speaks better English than most officers I know." "And those documents?" The lieutenant trailed off, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Communication came through Apache signal fires, messages flashed from peak to peak in the ancient language of smoke and flame. Doc had managed to get word through to the territorial capital, but help was still a day's ride away at minimum. They had to hold until dawn, then through another day, then hope justice arrived before their ammunition ran out. The medical situation grew more critical as the night progressed. Carlos was running a fever, his small legs swollen and hot to the touch. Ayana's infection was spreading, red lines creeping up her arm despite everything Doc could do with their limited supplies. Rosa worked with quiet determination, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "We need a doctor," Jake said, watching Doc struggle with another coughing fit. "I am a doctor," Doc replied when he could speak again. "Just not a very healthy one." Around 3 in the morning, Morrison made his most desperate gambit yet. Artillery shells began falling on the compound, mortars lobbed from the ridges in an attempt to force surrender through sheer destruction. The adobe walls cracked under the bombardment, and Jake realized they were running out of time. Jake found Ayana on the back porch during a lull in the fighting, bandaging fresh wounds by moonlight. Her fever had returned, but her hands stayed steady as she worked, the same quiet courage that had sustained her people through decades of warfare. "I've been thinking about home," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Your father's village?" Jake asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "No." She looked up at him with eyes bright as stars. "This place. these people who chose to stand with us. Home isn't where you come from, it's where your heart chooses to stay. The attack resumed at first light, Morrison's men trying to overwhelm the ranch through sheer firepower. Bullets shattered windows and splintered walls, but the defenders held their positions. Apache war cries mixed with Spanish prayers and Doc's sardonic laughter as he picked off targets with surgeon's precision. As the eastern sky began to lighten, a new sound carried across the desert, the thunder of approaching horses. But these riders came from the north, flying territorial colors instead of federal ones. The territorial governor's investigator had arrived with shocking news that would change everything. Marshal Wade, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the territory of Arizona. The words rang across the battlefield like a bell, spoken by a federal investigator whose authority superseded Wade's corrupted badge. Territorial Governor Fremont had sent his best man to clean house, and the evidence was overwhelming. Special Agent Harrison carried documents that exposed the conspiracy all the way back to Washington, a paper trail of corruption that reached from mining boardrooms to federal offices. Wade tried one last desperate gambit, claiming the Apache had attacked federal officers in the performance of their duties. His lies came fast and desperate, but they crumbled when Ayanna stepped forward, displaying credentials that stunned everyone present. "I am Special Investigator Ayanna Naichi," she said, her voice carrying despite her wounds, deputized by the territorial government to investigate federal corruption in Apache affairs. Everything that happened here was part of an authorized investigation. Jake stared at her in amazement, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Not just Chief Naichi's daughter, a federal agent working undercover to expose the mining conspiracy. Her education at the mission school, her perfect English, her careful observation of details, it all made sense now. He'd unknowingly protected a law enforcement officer, turning their desperate stand into an official government operation. The peace mission was cover, Ayanna continued, producing her badge from its hiding place sewn into her dress. I was gathering evidence of illegal land sales and staged raids. The documents I carried contained proof of the entire conspiracy. Agent Harrison examined the mining contracts and federal correspondence while Wade's face went ashen. The evidence was damning. Morrison's payments to federal officials, orders to stage Apache raids, plans to eliminate witnesses who might expose the truth. A conspiracy that reached from Arizona territory all the way to the Interior Department in Washington. These contracts, Harrison said, holding up Morrison's papers, show mineral rights purchased for lands not yet legally available. The raids were staged to justify military action and forced relocation. Marshal Wade, you've been taking money from private mining interests to abuse your federal authority. Morrison's hired killers found themselves facing territorial militia instead of isolated ranchers. The banker himself tried to flee, but Chief Naichi's warriors had closed all the escape routes hours ago. Justice was coming for the men who'd killed his people for silver coins, and Apache justice was both swift and final. The final gunfight was brief but decisive. Morrison fell with his stolen wealth scattered in the dust, his blood mixing with the silver coins he'd valued more than human life. Wade surrendered rather than face Apache justice, understanding that territorial custody was his only chance of surviving the morning. But the victory came at a cost. Young Carlos was burning with fever, his leg wound infected despite Rosa's careful nursing. Doc Holliday was coughing up more blood than ever, his consumption accelerated by the stress of battle, and Ayanna's shoulder wound had reopened during the fighting, fresh blood soaking through her bandages. Jake helped her to a chair as the territorial investigator took statements from witnesses. Her face was pale as moonlight, but her smile was bright as sunrise when she looked at him. "You knew," Jake said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "This whole time you knew exactly who you were." "I knew who I was," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I learned who you were. That made all the difference." Agent Harrison's investigation moved quickly. Testimony from multiple witnesses corroborating the evidence found in Morrison's papers. Federal soldiers who'd been following illegal orders were given amnesty in exchange for cooperation. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful just hours before crumbled like a house built on sand. Chief Nietzsche approached them as the dust settled, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder. For a moment, Jake expected to die for his presumption in loving an Apache woman. Instead, the chief extended his hand in the white man's gesture of respect, his weathered face showing something Jake had never expected to see: gratitude. "You protected my daughter when I could not," Nietzsche said, his English formal but sincere. "You stood against armies for her honor. This makes you family, if you choose to accept such honor." The question hung in the air between them, not just between Jake and the chief, but between Jake and Ayanna herself. The investigation was over, the conspiracy exposed, justice served. She could return to her people with honor, resume her career as a federal investigator, or— "The choice is yours," Jake told her, meaning it completely despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. "I'll respect whatever you decide." Ayanna looked at her father, then at the ranch where ordinary people had risked everything for truth. Children were laughing in the courtyard despite their wounds, Apache and Mexican and white together, while their parents shared water and stories of survival. Miguel was teaching Apache warriors how to repair the damaged well, while Rosa distributed food to anyone who was hungry. "Home is where your heart chooses to stay," she said, taking Jake's scarred hand in hers with fingers that trembled only slightly. "My heart chooses here." Chief Nietzsche nodded slowly, understanding passing between father and daughter in the ancient language of looks and gestures. "Then you have my blessing, daughter. And you, Jake Brennan, have earned the respect of the Apache Nation." But even as justice triumphed and love declared itself, Jake could see the cost written in Ayanna's pale face and labored breathing. The choice was made, but would she live to see it through? 6 months later, the Brennan Nietzsche Ranch had become something new, a place where cultures met without bloodshed, where justice was possible even on the frontier. The territorial investigation had reached all the way to Washington, exposing a network of corruption that stretched from mining companies to federal marshals. 3 senators had been censured, a dozen federal officials faced criminal charges, and new laws protected Apache burial grounds from commercial exploitation. Wade faced life in Yuma prison for his crimes, while Morrison's death had ended the immediate threat to Apache lands. Jake and Ayanna were married on a spring morning when the desert bloomed with unexpected flowers. The ceremony took place in the courtyard they'd defended together, surrounded by friends who'd proven themselves family through blood and sacrifice. Chief Nietzsche performed the Apache ceremony, while Doc Holliday, in his capacity as an ordained minister, handled the Christian vows. Two traditions joined into something stronger than either alone. "Do you, Jake Brennan, take this woman to be your wife, to protect and honor her as long as you both shall live?" Doc asked, his voice steady despite the consumption that would claim him within a year. "I do," Jake said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I already have been, since the day I found her." Ayanna wore his grandmother's ring alongside traditional Apache beadwork, her shoulder healed but bearing scars that would always remind them of the price of truth. She'd recovered fully from her wounds, though Doc said it had been touch and go for weeks. Her federal investigation work had earned her commendations and a transfer to less dangerous duties, but she'd chosen instead to retire from government service. "I spent too many years being who others needed me to be," she'd told Jake during her recovery. "Now I want to be who I choose to be." Miguel had been promoted to foreman, his family officially part of the ranch's extended household. His children played with visiting Apache cousins, learning 2 languages and 3 cultures as naturally as breathing. Young Carlos walked with a slight limp from his war wound, but he wore it like a badge of honor, telling anyone who'd listen about the time he fought alongside Apache warriors. Rosa's kitchen became the heart of a community that shouldn't have existed but somehow did. Apache women taught her traditional recipes, while she shared Mexican cooking techniques that had been passed down through generations. The blending of flavors mirrored the blending of peoples, creating something entirely new. The wedding reception lasted 3 days, with Apache drums and Mexican guitars sharing the same songs. Federal officials came to offer apologies and promises of reform, though Jake trusted their words about as far as he could throw a bull. Territorial newspapers declared the ranch a model for peaceful coexistence, bringing visitors from as far away as California and Colorado. But for Jake, the only thing that mattered was the woman beside him, moving through the celebration with quiet grace. She'd chosen to stay, chosen him, chosen a life that would never be simple but would always be theirs. They built a new house on the hill overlooking the valley, with rooms for the children they hoped to raise and windows facing both sunrise and sunset. Apache visitors were welcome. Mexican traders brought news from the south, and white settlers learned that peace was more profitable than war. The ranch became a crossroads where different worlds met and found common ground. Doc Holliday stayed through the summer, claiming the dry air helped his condition. In truth, he'd found something rare on the frontier, a place where being different wasn't a death sentence, where healing was possible for even the most wounded souls. He taught the children card tricks and philosophy in equal measure, leaving them richer for his presence. The ranch prospered as word spread of their success. Cattle thrived under Apache protection, crops grew with Mexican agricultural wisdom, and trade relationships flourished in the atmosphere of mutual respect. Other communities began to follow their example, proving that cooperation was possible even in the harshest circumstances. Agent Harrison returned periodically with updates on the federal investigation. The conspiracy had been larger than anyone imagined, reaching into mining companies across the West. But the evidence gathered at the ranch had broken it wide open, leading to reforms in federal Indian policy and greater oversight of territorial officials. "You did more than save one woman," Harrison told Jake during his last visit. "You helped save the integrity of federal law enforcement." On quiet evenings, Jake and Ayana would sit on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. She would work on beadwork while he cleaned his guns, comfortable in the silence that said more than words ever could. Sometimes Chief Naichi would join them, sharing stories of the old days when the world was simpler, but no less dangerous. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd ridden past that canyon?" she asked one evening, her hands never pausing in their intricate work. Jake considered the question seriously, as he considered all her questions. "I reckon the world would be a little darker place," he said. "Some folks are worth saving, even when you don't know why at the time." "Especially then," she agreed, her hand finding his as the first stars appeared. They'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of hatred, proving that love was stronger than prejudice, that justice was possible even in an unjust world. Their story became legend, passed down through generations as proof that ordinary people could change history when they chose courage over comfort. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs while Apache drums echoed softly across the valley. The sound was no longer threatening but celebratory, the heartbeat of a community that had learned to turn enemies into family, strangers into friends, and hatred into hope. Now, you might be thinking this is just another story about the Old West, about cowboys and Indians and the way things used to be. But let me tell you something, friend. This story ain't about the past, it's about right now. Every day, we see folks getting written off by society, marked as worthless, left for dead, forgotten by people who ought to know better. Could be someone who looks different, talks different, believes different than what's considered proper. The question is, what do you do when you come across someone the world's given up on? Jake Brennan didn't have much. Lost his wife, lost his boy, lived alone with his cattle and his memories. He'd built walls around his heart, higher than the mountains that surrounded his ranch. But when he found that Apache girl torn up and left to die, he had a choice. The easy thing would have been to ride on by, mind his own business, stay safe behind those walls. The right thing cost him everything he thought he wanted, and gave him everything he actually needed. See, that's the thing about love, real love, the kind that matters. It ain't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone worth fighting for, even when the whole world thinks you're a fool. Especially then. It's about seeing the worth in a person when nobody else can see past the surface, when society's already written them off as worthless. Ayana could have gone back to her people when this was all over, could have resumed her career as a federal investigator, made a name for herself in government service. Nobody would have blamed her for choosing duty over a scarred-up rancher with more enemies than sense. But home ain't where you come from, it's where you choose to stay. And family ain't always the blood in your veins. Sometimes it's the folks who stick around when everybody else walks away. In this old world, we got too much hate and not near enough understanding. Too much talking at each other and not near enough listening to each other. Too much judging by what's different and not near enough seeing what's the same. We got people building walls when we ought to be building bridges, choosing fear when we ought to be choosing hope. But every now and then, someone like Jake Brennan comes along and reminds us what it means to be human. Someone who looks past the color of skin or the shape of words and sees straight through to the soul underneath. Someone who understands that mercy ain't weakness, it's the strongest thing a person can choose. So next time you see someone's society's written off, remember this story. Remember that every person's got worth, even if the world can't see it. Remember that doing right costs something, but not doing right costs everything that matters. Remember that love, real love, sees what others miss and chooses to protect it. The world's full of folks building empires on other people's suffering, making profits from other people's pain. But it's also full of ordinary people like Jake and Ayana and Miguel and Rosa, folks who understand that standing together is stronger than standing apart, that choosing love over fear changes everything. And if this old tale touched something in your heart, maybe you'd share it with someone who needs reminding that love still matters in this hard world. Because stories like this, they're worth remembering. They're worth passing on. They remind us that no matter how dark things get, there's always someone willing to light a candle. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in love that costs everything and pays it back tenfold, because that's the kind of love that changes the world, one heart at a time.